This is also a time of change for my family.
King Charles had entered the private meeting expecting a difficult legal briefing. He did not expect to be told that the Crown Estate, the institution tied more closely than any other to sovereign authority, would pass into the hands of his sister. When the senior lawyer finally spoke Anne's name, the king's expression collapsed. He lowered his eyes, pushed the file away, and remained completely silent as everyone in the room understood that the monarchy had just changed. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles sat inside a locked Buckingham Palace meeting with Anne, William, 2 senior crown lawyers, and a constitutional advisor. Phones had been removed before the discussion began, and a sealed estate file rested at the center of the table. The Crown Estate, a vast property and investment institution linked to the sovereign, carried more than wealth. It represented influence, continuity, and the machinery supporting royal authority across generations. The lead lawyer opened the file and stated the central ruling clearly. A binding succession provision named Princess Anne as the sole inheriting authority over the estate's private governing interests, strategic oversight, and protected family holdings after Charles's reign. A succession provision is a legal instruction deciding how authority passes when specific conditions are met. The language left no room for ceremonial interpretation. Charles challenged it immediately. The king assumed Anne had been granted only an honorary trusteeship, a symbolic role without final control. When the lawyer clarified that she would possess genuine authority, his hand tightened around the chair. The monarch had believed these powers would remain connected to his direct line. Now they were moving sideways to his sister. Anne showed no triumph. She remained rigid across from Charles, disturbed by the pain in his face. The princess understood that the ruling gave her something her brother considered part of his legacy, and every second of silence made that gift feel heavier. William then noticed the signatures on the final page. Queen Elizabeth II's name appeared beside an older royal seal, proving the arrangement had been protected for years. The prince looked toward Anne, but she avoided his eyes. The lawyers revealed through the meeting's recorded legal account that Charles had never received the complete inheritance schedule. A restricted appendix and added section kept sealed until legal conditions were fulfilled could only be opened after a formal review of estate management. Charles pushed his chair back and asked one question before anyone could leave. How long did Anne know? The room went still. The inheritance ruling had wounded the king, but the greater pain would come from discovering who had carried the secret and why his own sister had been placed at the center of it. Long before lawyers placed the Crown Estate between them, Charles and Anne had survived the pressures of royal life in very different ways. He carried expectation like a burden that never loosened. She carried duty like armor. Now, inside one silent palace room, those differences had become impossible to ignore. Charles saw an inheritance taken from his legacy. Anne saw a responsibility she had never requested. And William saw a family fracture forming directly beneath the crown. Charles had spent decades tying his identity to land, stewardship, architecture, farming, and royal property. Stewardship meant protecting valuable places and resources for those who would inherit them later. To the king, estate management was never merely financial. It proved that years of preparation, criticism, and persistence had created something lasting. Losing control made him feel that his life's work had been judged before it was complete. Anne represented the opposite instinct. The Princess Royal had built her reputation through discipline, blunt honesty, and relentless public service. She showed little interest in grandeur, and even less in personal praise. Her suitability came from reliability, not ambition. Yet that distinction offered Charles no comfort when he saw her speaking quietly with the lawyers after the meeting. Charles watched from the corridor and misread her composure as acceptance. The king believed his sister had already stepped into a future created by his displacement. Every controlled nod seemed like confidence. Every lowered voice felt like evidence that she understood more than she had admitted. Anne later stood alone beside a palace window, gripping the back of a chair. William approached and found anger where he expected triumph. The prince asked whether she had known the outcome. She answered through a recorded private conversation that watching Charles absorb the ruling had been worse than receiving it herself. Anne had not wanted his authority. She had wanted the family protected from a crisis she still did not fully understand. William then repeated something Elizabeth had once told him privately. Anne was the safeguard when blood becomes divided. He had never understood the sentence until that day. The late queen had not been praising her daughter's rank. She had been describing her function. Anne finally revealed what she knew. A protected arrangement existed, but she had never seen its complete scope. The princess believed it concerned emergency administration, a temporary system allowing someone trusted to act if royal management became unstable. She had not known it granted lasting control over the estate. Then Charles summoned William alone. The king demanded that his son choose between his father's legacy and Elizabeth's hidden decision. William's answer could not be separated from the past, because the roots of Anne's inheritance reached back to one decisive royal confrontation that Charles had never been allowed to forget. The decision did not begin with a lawyer, a sealed appendix, or a signature hidden inside palace archives. It began years earlier, during a bitter private meeting at Balmoral, when Queen Elizabeth watched two competing visions for the monarchy collide. Charles wanted modernization, guided by the sovereign. Anne demanded protections that no future monarch could quietly remove. By the time the meeting ended, a silver pen lay untouched on the table, and the Queen had made the choice that would one day devastate her son. Elizabeth had grown increasingly uneasy about placing too much estate authority inside one sovereign household. The sovereign household meant the private staff, advisors, and financial arrangements surrounding the reigning monarch. Her concern was simple but serious. Land and property meant to serve generations could be redirected by personal loyalties, temporary pressures, or the priorities of one reign. The Queen began consulting constitutional lawyers about separating symbolic kingship from selected private governing powers. Those powers covered protected crown holdings and long-term estate stewardship, meaning the responsibility to preserve land, wealth, and historic assets for future use. Elizabeth believed the monarch could remain the institution's central symbol without holding unrestricted control over every protected interest. Charles saw the discussions as a judgment against him. He had spent his life preparing to succeed his mother, developing strong views on farming, architecture, conservation, and royal management. To him, procedure had begun replacing trust. The future king felt Elizabeth believed lawyers more than the son who had carried expectation for decades. Anne challenged him during several private debates. The Princess Royal argued that royal land could never become an extension of one household's wishes. Charles heard accusation in her warning. She heard danger in his certainty. Their disagreement became personal, even as both continued pretending publicly that nothing had changed. The point of no return came during the Balmoral stewardship meeting. Charles proposed transferring a protected rural holding into a new management structure controlled entirely by the future sovereign's office. Anne pushed the folder back across the table and told Elizabeth, "Once this leaves collective protection, it will never return." Silence followed. Elizabeth ended the meeting without signing the transfer. The Queen kept the papers and summoned her private solicitor that evening. A private solicitor is a lawyer trusted to handle confidential personal and institutional instructions. According to the documented legal account, she ordered the creation of a sealed inheritance schedule before midnight, naming Anne as the future protective authority. Charles later learned that his proposal had been blocked. He never discovered that his sister's objection had triggered a response far greater than one rejected transfer. What Charles had remembered as an old disagreement was now revealed as the moment his mother redirected the future, and he was ready to confront the sister whose warning had altered everything. Charles did not confront Anne in the council chamber or before a wall of advisors. He waited until the lawyers had gone, dismissed the remaining staff, and closed the door himself. For several seconds, brother and sister stood facing each other without speaking. Then the king placed the sealed appendix on a side table and asked the question he had been holding back. "Did you ask our mother to take this from me?" Anne's answer shattered the silence, but not his anger. Charles had chosen a small private drawing room where the two of them had once spoken informally as siblings. The familiar setting made the distance between them feel brutal. The sealed appendix and added legal section containing restricted instructions remained beside him, like proof that their mother had trusted paper more than conversation. Anne arrived without aids or documents. Neither could hide behind office, rank, or protocol. Charles placed the file down with controlled force and accused his sister of using Elizabeth's trust to secure power. The king said Anne had turned private concern into permanent authority and allowed him to inherit a throne stripped of control he believed belonged with it. Anne stepped closer. The Princess Royal told him she had never asked to inherit anything. She had not requested the estate, designed the schedule, or sought authority over her brother. What she had done was warn their mother that protected property could not survive if every future household treated it as personal security. Charles refused to accept that distinction. He argued that Anne could have warned him once she became aware of the arrangement. Years had passed. Their mother had died. Yet his sister had allowed him to govern without knowing that legal barriers already surrounded his decisions. Anne answered through the recorded account of their private exchange. Elizabeth had commanded silence. Breaking that promise would have betrayed both sovereign duty and the woman who had trusted her as a daughter. The Queen feared Charles would attempt to reverse the schedule before it activated, so she constructed protections, preventing any single monarch from dismantling it. The revelation deepened the wound. Anne then explained why Elizabeth had chosen her. Their mother had never doubted Charles's love for the monarchy. She doubted whether love alone could withstand pressure from advisors, competing households, private fears, and future family divisions. Anne had been selected because she could enforce a boundary even when compassion urged retreat. Charles stared at her, then asked whether Camilla's household had influenced Elizabeth's concern. Anne's expression changed. She refused to answer until William was present. That refusal told Charles the secret extended beyond one argument at Balmoral and beyond the two siblings standing before each other. The confrontation had exposed the wound, but the true architecture of the decision and the forces Elizabeth feared remained locked inside the legal powers now surrounding Anne. Anne had inherited more than land, income, or a prestigious royal role. She had inherited a system deliberately designed to resist pressure from the throne itself. Every clause Elizabeth approved carried the same message. Stewardship must survive personality, marriage, ambition, and succession. Yet as advisors explained the extent of Anne's authority, she did not look powerful. She looked burdened. Sitting alone at the end of the long table, she realized that protecting the crown estate might require her to oppose the king again. Anne's authority reached across protected family estates, strategic approvals, preservation covenants, succession safeguards, and major structural transfers linked to the crown estate's private royal interests. A preservation covenant is a binding rule preventing historic property from being altered, sold, or redirected without formal approval. These powers mattered because they protected assets meant to serve generations, not the immediate needs of one household. Charles still retained constitutional dignity and public sovereignty. The king remained the nation's monarch, yet he could not unilaterally sell, restructure, or place protected holdings under personal household control. Elizabeth had separated public kingship from selected private estate powers, ensuring that royal status alone could not defeat the safeguards she created. Anne stayed behind after the briefing. The Princess Royal asked the senior lawyer whether she could legally refuse the inheritance. Her question exposed the burden beneath her discipline. The lawyer answered through the documented meeting record that refusal would activate an outside trusteeship, meaning independent managers would control the protected holdings. Elizabeth had specifically designed the arrangement to prevent that outcome. Anne's shoulders sank. William entered moments later and told her that Charles viewed the entire structure as a public humiliation waiting to happen. The prince understood his father's pain, but he also saw what accepting the role could cost Anne. She answered that she had defended her brother throughout their lives. Now duty might destroy the relationship she had spent decades protecting. The constitutional advisor then disclosed another restriction. Elizabeth required Anne's approval before estate privileges could be granted to spouses, extended relatives, or non-working royal households. A non-working royal household refers to family members who hold royal connections but perform no regular official duties. Personal affection could no longer create permanent estate rights. A second clause changed the future again. William was named as Anne's eventual successor within the stewardship structure. The late queen had built a bridge from her daughter to the future king, temporarily limiting Charles's complete authority while preserving the direct line beyond him. Then one pending proposal reached the table. It concerned privileges connected to Queen Camilla's family. Charles learned that the request could proceed only with Anne's signature. The ruling was no longer confined to inheritance papers. It was about to enter bedrooms, offices, family arrangements, and the daily machinery of royal life. By the following morning, the palace had changed without a single public announcement. Files were redirected. Meetings were postponed. Officials who once sought approval from the king's household were instructed to contact Anne's office instead. The shift was quiet, procedural, and devastatingly visible. Charles noticed it when an estate secretary removed a red folder from his mourning box. Camilla noticed it when a planned family arrangement disappeared from the schedule. The legal ruling had begun reshaping real lives. Palace departments moved quickly because the lawyers had confirmed that Anne's authority was already active. It would not begin after another ceremony or future review. Estate correspondence, development proposals, private residence allocations, and preservation decisions now pass through her stewardship office. A stewardship office is the team responsible for protecting property, reviewing long-term plans, and ensuring royal assets serve the institution rather than one household. Charles felt the change during his morning briefing. The king reached for a red estate folder, but his private secretary quietly removed it and explained that Anne's authorization was now required. Charles said nothing. He stared at the empty space where the file had been, understanding that power had not vanished in one dramatic blow. It was disappearing page by page. Camilla received her own notice soon afterward. A proposed long-term residence arrangement for one of her relatives had been frozen. The Queen asked Charles whether Anne had ordered it personally. He tried to soften the answer, but he could not hide the truth. His sister now held the legal authority to stop the arrangement, and his approval no longer carried final weight. Anne's first formal decision was not an attack. The Princess Royal paused every pending family-related allocation until independent reviews could determine whether each served the estate or merely reflected private preference. That distinction mattered, because protected royal property could not become compensation for loyalty, marriage, or fear about the future. William then discovered something more troubling. One proposal connected to Camilla's wider household had been accelerated only days before the restricted appendix was opened. The prince immediately understood what that timing suggested. Someone inside the palace may have known control was about to change and tried to secure approval before Anne's authority became active. Charles heard the suspicion forming and braced for another accusation. William chose a different path. The future king refused to begin with advisors, investigators, or legal threats. He asked his father to meet him alone. William believed procedure had already done enough damage. Only honesty could prevent the ruling from becoming permanent family warfare. As the palace adjusted to Anne's authority, William prepared to confront the deeper question: whether Charles wanted justice, revenge, or simply reassurance that he still mattered. William found his father in a private library, with no secretary, no legal advisor, and no royal papers open before him. Charles was sitting beside the fire, staring at a photograph of Elizabeth and Anne, taken decades earlier. When William entered, the king did not ask about the estate. He asked whether his own mother had ever truly trusted him. It was the first honest question he had spoken since the ruling, and the future king knew that answering carelessly could deepen a wound no court could repair. William had spent the previous day studying the legal schedule and speaking separately with Anne, the lawyers, and estate officials. A legal schedule is a detailed document setting out when powers transfer and which conditions control them. He now understood that the arrangement did not remove Charles from the monarchy. It limited one area of private institutional control while preserving his position as sovereign, father, and central public figure. Charles finally admitted what had been consuming him. The king said Anne's inheritance felt like a judgment delivered by Elizabeth after death, leaving him unable to defend himself or ask why she had chosen such a severe path. He could challenge lawyers, advisors, and even his sister. He could not question his mother. William sat opposite him and answered with care. Elizabeth's decision, he said, did not prove that she loved Anne more or trusted Charles less. It proved that she understood the different strengths of her children. The late queen knew her daughter could enforce boundaries without needing praise, while her son carried a vision powerful enough to become vulnerable under pressure. Charles listened without interrupting. William then revealed something Anne had offered during their recorded private conversation. The Princess Royal wanted to create a joint advisory process, allowing Charles to be heard on every major estate decision, even though she had no legal duty to share authority. A joint advisory process is a formal system in which one person holds final power but must consider another person's experience before acting. William disclosed more. Anne's first instruction had protected Charles's environmental projects and heritage initiatives from future cancellation. She had preserved the programs most closely tied to his life's work before reviewing anything connected to family privilege. The future king told his father that his sister was not erasing his legacy. She was securing its strongest parts against future change. Charles looked again at the photograph. The anger had not vanished, but its shape had changed. The king finally agreed to meet Anne again, not as a sovereign challenging an inheritor, but as a brother willing to hear what she intended to do with their mother's final command. Their private reconciliation was still fragile, but before Charles and Anne could define the new arrangement, the hidden ruling escaped the palace and became a national spectacle. At dawn, Britain awoke to a royal headline no palace statement had prepared the public to understand. The words were enormous, black, and impossible to soften. Anne inherits crown estate, power king bypassed. Within hours, broadcasters filled studio screens with images of Charles and his sister standing yards apart at an earlier ceremony. Outside Buckingham Palace, tourists stopped beneath the gates, reading updates from their phones. A private family wound had become a public judgment on the monarchy. The confusion began because a summary of the legal confirmation reached the press before the palace completed its response. The constitutional crown estate is the public property portfolio connected to the sovereign, while the protected royal interests in Anne's inheritance schedule concerned private governing powers and safeguarded family holdings. Newsrooms blurred that distinction, making the ruling appear to strip Charles of the institution itself. Commentators rushed to explain that the king remained sovereign, yet the word bypassed dominated every discussion. Charles watched the morning coverage without speaking. The monarch endured photographs of himself beside Anne, diagrams of changing authority, and endless claims that Elizabeth had chosen one child over another. He turned off the television only when an old image of his mother appeared beside his sister. Anne received the same headlines while traveling to an official engagement. The Princess Royal refused to cancel, knowing retreat would be mistaken for guilt or triumph. Before leaving the car, however, she paused for several seconds and asked an aide whether Charles had issued a statement. Her concern was not for her own reputation. She feared the coverage would deepen her brother's humiliation before they could speak again. Then one front page transformed the story into emotional theater. It showed Anne walking ahead of Charles beneath the headline, "The Queen's Final Choice." At the Victoria Memorial, a crowd gathered as a broadcaster read the legal clarification aloud. When the report mentioned Anne's lifetime of service, applause unexpectedly broke out. The reaction was not against Charles. It reflected public trust in the woman now carrying Elizabeth's safeguard. The palace finally released a statement jointly approved by brother and sister. It confirmed the protected arrangement, while stressing continuity, shared duty, and preservation of long-term royal assets. Charles remained monarch. Anne would exercise the authority assigned to her. Neither role erased the other. The statement calmed constitutional fears, but it could not settle the deeper family question. Tolerance was not acceptance, and silence was no longer enough. The world had delivered its verdict in headlines, But the emotional verdict belonged to Charles, and it could only be given directly to the sister, now holding their mother's trust. The final meeting contained no lawyers, no sealed appendices, and no advisors waiting outside the door. Charles and Anne sat together with Elizabeth's original instruction placed between them. This time, the king did not push it away. He read every line slowly, including the passage explaining why responsibility had been divided between her children. When he finished, Charles looked across at his sister and understood the truth at last. Anne had not inherited his crown. She had inherited the duty of protecting it. Charles had agreed to meet in the same Balmoral room where their old dispute had first forced Elizabeth to act. The location mattered because it returned the legal crisis to its emotional beginning. Anne placed a formal stewardship plan before him. Stewardship meant protecting land and institutions for future generations, rather than treating them as personal possessions. Her plan preserved his environmental work, restoration projects, agricultural principles, and long-term vision for royal property. Charles finally spoke without anger. The king admitted that losing control had not devastated him because of wealth. It had wounded him because he believed his mother's final decision declared him unworthy. Anne answered that Elizabeth had trusted him to reign. She had trusted her daughter to hold the line when pressure, loneliness, or competing households made clear judgment difficult. Anne's words stripped away the rivalry he had imagined. The Princess Royal had not been chosen as a replacement. She had been made a safeguard. Charles moved Elizabeth's instruction toward his sister and placed his hand over hers. He apologized for accusing her of ambition. Anne admitted that obeying their mother had cost her the honesty she wished she could have offered him years earlier. Silence had protected the arrangement, but it had also damaged the bond between them. Anne then unfolded the final legal page. Beneath it was a handwritten sentence that had remained hidden during the earlier briefings. Charles carries the crown forward. Anne ensures it cannot be carried away. The words resolved everything. Charles signed a formal declaration recognizing Anne's authority and creating a cooperative council with William as future steward. A cooperative council is a shared advisory body that allows several royals to guide major decisions while one person retains final legal responsibility. The arrangement ended the internal challenge and prevented rival households from exploiting the division. Anne inherited legal control. Charles retained his dignity as king. William gained a model of monarchy built on restraint rather than unchecked possession. In the end, Charles was devastated because he believed something had been taken from him. But Elizabeth's final design proved the opposite. By trusting Anne with the estate, she protected her son's legacy, preserved the crown for William, and ensured that royal duty would remain greater than any individual who wore it. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.